and welcome. Hello, we are joined by Sir David Adjaye. Hello, David. It's brilliant to have you here. Thank you so much for doing this. We've had a day, David, where we've been talking about global leadership, or perhaps more importantly, the absence of global leadership and what you do about it. And the reason we are so thrilled to have you is that, to an extent, the events of 2020 have revealed more than they've actually changed. They've shown elements of the way in which inequality is a lived experience, food security is a problem, debt is dealt with so differently and unfairly. But in one way, it strikes us that it has fundamentally changed the way we think, and it's about our built environment. We've never had a moment where the world has treated offices, transport, the home in the same way, or at least thought about it in the same way. And so what we were hoping in this, which is our penultimate session, David, to do is to try and hear from you how you think the great themes and events of 2020, and I suppose specifically I'm thinking about the pandemic and what that's done in terms of the way we live, but also the killing of George Floyd and a radicalization of people around injustice and inequality, how those two things have affected you and the way you think about cities, buildings, and the environment we live in. And I know this is the first time you've done a think-in, so I'm just going to tell you, it's a pretty chaotic thing. The idea of like a news meeting. So not only I will say, well, David, can you explain this? Or tell us what you think. But likewise, anyone who's joining us will weigh in with their point of view, their experience, a question or a point to you. And as you'll see, we have hundreds of people who've joined us, mostly I suspect because they already know who you are. But for the probably two or three who don't, I should just say, Sir David Adjaye, who joins us in Accra, in Ghana, that great city, is one of those things. He is a contested national treasure. So I think Ghanaian and British. So I've no doubt at all that if you are Ghanaian, people would say David Adjaye, the great Ghanaian architect, and if you're a Brit, you say David Adjaye, the great British architect, and that way we can equally arm wrestle over this. But people will know and understand, you know, your work most famously, of course, in Washington D.C., the Museum of African American History. But actually, the thing that really strikes me, David, is so much of your architecture is linked to ideas and individuals and what they've done, and specifically the politics of what they've done, going all the way back to the Stephen Lawrence Center. So I hope everyone will weigh in. I hope you'll join in and recognize this is really all of us a conversation with David. But David, will you start by telling us how your thinking about the way we live has changed in 2020?
Thank you, James. It's wonderful to be on this forum. I think 2020 is definitely, as you have said and other people have mentioned, undoubtedly going to be, I think, the time that we look back on that actually tragically has caused many deaths of many human beings and revealed so many conditions. But in a way, what it has done profoundly, I think, is to create a global pause in a way that we've not had for a profound amount of time. And that global pause has had massive ramifications on all of the people who are, you know, I'm going to speak from the built environment's point of view, you know, sort of really thinking about everything from architects to mayors of cities to anybody that's involved with the sort of economics and politics and, you know, delivery of the built environment. And I think what it's shown is that we've sort of been on a roller coaster and sort of been just riding this thing because it had motion, as it were, to use the metaphor, and really have not really been able to search back, you know, pause and really reflect on how successful some of these models that we've been deploying in our cities and how we've been making our cities and how effective they've become. It's like that because cities are incredibly expensive to make, and it's difficult for people after the investments have been made to sort of criticize that sort of massive investment, is saying, well, actually we made a mistake here and not. But here we are in a situation where there is just nothing else but analysis that we can make on the built environment. And we can look at it from the injustice of city planning to the contested nature of public realm. What is public space? You know, the fundamental questions about, you know, the street, which I'm loving, seeing how, you know, the public space has been retaken by protests. You know, public space was kind of designed for the gathering of people. And I think in 2020, we're reminded again of why public space was made. It is a requirement that citizens in a sort of large agglomeration have the ability to gather and to be visible. It's part of the image of what a city does. We're not just supposed to disappear. And, you know, there are questions now about, you know, why have we given so much to cars? Yeah. Why have we not privileged the human experience in our cities much more? Why have we shortchanged that? Was that a, you know, I know that in the 60s there were many conversations and people thought they were kind of a little bit too fantastical about the hierarchy of vehicles and pedestrian experience. But what we're realizing now is that actually those ideas were very brilliant. Maybe not as articulate as it should have been, but this idea of layering of infrastructure, which has always been part of the idea of the 20th century's thinking about cities, but never got really implemented except for in small brutalist projects, which were not done well, was actually profoundly, you know, important to understanding how we privilege the human experience in the city. Because privileging the human experience in the city is fundamental to creating the well-being, creating the relationship to nature that we all require and crave, that gives us the resilience that we need to be close to each other in this thing that we've invented called cities. Mm-hmm. So I think that this, for me, what's been the great takeaway is that the pause has meant that we can look at everything, every topology. Office buildings, you know, office buildings have been predicated on a sort of slightly medical analysis of quantity and efficiency. You know, we've also turned architecture into kind of a medical science. What's the problem? Take the solution. And, you know, pre-pandemic, it was take the solution from an efficiency point of view and, you know, a sort of best value efficiency. Well, best value and efficiency creates certain dumb boxes and certain conditions, which we're now realizing can be absolutely useless when that sort of condition actually ceases to exist. So, you know, I think what is kind of wonderful for me, and the problem is that some of these decision-making sort of elements in our city are private sector, and they are led by that diagram. And what we're is that the politics of the city can't just be left to the private sector. It's a continual dance between, I think, research, science, policy, and, you know, and then delivery. And it really has to be some kind of ongoing analysis and some kind of ongoing experiment. It's not just, you know, what looks good to our eyes. It needs to be tested, just like everything else. It's somehow, you know, we somehow wait for waves of sort of, you know, either migrant crashes, pandemics, or things like that before we reflect on the city, because we just simply don't want to question the kind of image of the city. And I think that for me, I hope we're going to enter an age where that pauses and that the idea of really evaluating what value and finding metrics to evaluate the value will become much more part of how we make our built environment. I mean, I think we're sort of in, you know, if every century is, you know, 0.0, we're sort of in, you know, 2.0, the city post the industrial age. You know, I'm not discounting anything up to then, but there was a kind of massive sort of acceleration from, you know, the 19th century to the 20th century because of industrialization and our ability to make so many things at once to house so many people. So we could bring so many people together, and then medical science kind of allowed us to kind of, you know, inoculate so many people so we could suddenly come together. This has only happened in the last 100 years. And then now in the 21st century, we're in this explosion of more sort of medical resilience, making us capable of being together, and now kind of bumping against the impacts of that in terms of what does it mean when we start to get to these critical numbers of 5, 10, 15, 20, 40, 50 million person cities. Yeah. And how do we survive that, you know?
And David, tell us, I want to hear a little about what your vision is for the city, but as a sort of first stop, I imagine something happens to you as an architect, which is that you go from just trying to get work where you can build buildings in cities to then having a moment where people are asking you to build buildings that remake their cities,
Yeah.
that reposition their cities globally. And I'm interested to know, in that change for you, what are you hearing from government in particular, from city leaders? What do they want in terms of economic dynamism, or as you say, public space, or a rebalancing, often around inequality and injustice in their space? And how does architecture deliver that?
In my arena and my interests, the social justice of the cities is something that I've sort of taken on board, and something that I'm very interested in. This idea that somehow if we can start to measure the quality of a city by its ability to be most generous and visible with all its constituents,
Mm-hmm.
it a better thriving city that's able to attract better investment, talent, etc., and hopefully create a much more livable sort of city for people to be in, and one where they feel that the value of the city is a reflection of the values that are inherently understood to be positive to its. So I find myself from working on the Washington Mall and building the National Museum of African American History and Culture, that building, when we finished it, 200 years in the making, 20 years to get to it, and 10 years to build, sort of remade the image of the front lawn of America. That suddenly there was a kind of image that started to better fit rather than become a fiction of a kind of idea of empire. It became something that started to reflect, and it's been amazing to watch how protesters have been using it, in the way that they used Washington's memorial or Lincoln's sort of, the pavilion, the sort of the structure that Lincoln's sort of memorial is enshrined in, as a kind of rallying cry for the identity of how they see the world. And so what's been interesting for me is that, and now we're working on a project in London for the Holocaust Memorial. We're working on projects in the UAE for a multi-faith Abrahamic center. We're working in Ghana on a kind of national cathedral, which is about a sort of nation building identity. So what we're finding is that we're moving into this idea of a kind of equity, or a kind of representation, or an aspiration of nations or cities or people to sort of really reflect in the built environment the aspirations that are in the citizens and in the sort of the politic.
And David, where does there are a number of people who have asked interesting questions. I'm going to bring in Rand Boydell, who makes an interesting point about the home, which is really interesting. And I see that Jess Dowson, I think her name is, has made an interesting point about picking up on your point about cars and people. So I'm going to bring those in about infrastructure. But where's the muscle in built environment, right? Does it sit in the mayor's office? Does it sit in a national government office? Does it realistically sit in the real estate developer's office? Does it sit in the investment funds that back those real estate investments? When you're thinking about these transformative projects for cities and our built environment, who are the ones who ultimately make the decision?
It's ultimately government. In the end, yeah. Ironically, at the bottom of this, where there's this, there is a negotiation with all the parts that you've just mentioned.
Yes.
But because we still, we are under the construction of the nation state, and in the end, it is the nation that decides the image of its built environment. Wow. It's extraordinary. Once that image is set, then they're part the sort of different parts of power enact it, as it were. It's enacted, and I literally can say that from the Washington Memorial to everything we're doing, without the sort of the convincing of government that this is a direction they want to move in, these projects would never have happened.
So that's absolutely fascinating. On the one hand, quite invigorating to me, because I thought that whole world happened behind closed doors, and at the same time, also a little bewildering, because I'm not sure how, as a citizen, you influence that thinking on government about your built environment. have you ever found yourself responding to citizen action, political activism?
All the time, all the time. I mean, one of the great things about the English planning system is that, you know, it's all about that public debate. It can go wrong, but it can also be very healthy if citizens kind of sort of join in on the discussion. But you know, being able to allow the debate to happen, but being able to also have experts to tune that, to make it objective, and to be able to find consensus between the unsaid agendas of, let's say, development, investment requirements that sometimes are contrary to what normal citizens might be thinking is the value that they want. But being able to somehow find a platform to share that would be the way in which, you know, there can be more equity in these kind of fraught dynamics. They're kind of fraught dynamics because there's a sense of wanting, you know, people to have, you know, almost as it were, the sort of citizen's right to say exactly how things are. But there's the overriding idea of what the bigger picture is, which is not necessarily incumbent on the citizen to kind of have all the information to make that decision on. So there's a kind of funny dance between, you know, having your say, but really not really.
Right. No, but to be fair, there's something equitable in that, in the sense that no single person should be able to make those calls. I said, David, that I'm going to bring in Ran. I think it's Ran, is it? Ran Bordell, who starts actually in a place that all of us are starting thinking about, which is our homes first. So Ran, do you want to make that point?
Thanks so much. And firstly, David, just to say, I'm an architect myself and a great admirer of your work. So I was definitely suckered into today, knowing that you were on board.
Very kind, Ran.
Yeah, the COVID lockdown has really stressed to everybody the importance of the home environment.
Yes.
And at the same time, the whole commercial property market looks like it could significantly shrink, both in terms of office space and in terms of retail space. And so there's a potential for a complete rebalancing of the property sector, which could be terribly disruptive for business investors and all that sort of thing, but also open up incredible opportunities to really put that focus back on housing. And I'll link it to a comment made by Robert and Brenda Vale, who did the autonomous house in Nottingham years ago now, where they referred to housing as being part of the national infrastructure.
Absolutely.
And so I really took note of a comment you made just then about how the nation state defines the image of what our infrastructure is. And that's not a way we're used to thinking about housing at all. So I just wonder, as a general discussion point, on the importance of housing post-lockdown.
I'm so glad you picked up on it. I think that we have to move past thinking that other people do that other thing, and that government does all the sort of big stuff like roads and defense and all those things. Government is part of that entire arsenal of things that defines who we are, and housing is, you know, as important as making roads for you know, infrastructure and efficiency and, you know, all those things. But what's interesting, I think, about what's happened with COVID and the housing market is that I think, you know, I like to see it as that we've done housing point one. You know, it's sort of housing one was just build as much of it as possible, and, you know, we'll deal with what it does. And what it's done is to create, you know, the sort of separation of typologies into just, here's just tons of offices because we think we need it. Here are tons of houses and we need it. And actually what is coming out is that we need to get much more complicated. That the human experience of being in the city has to be more than just being in one singular typology, getting into a vehicle or piece of infrastructure to go to another piece of infrastructure. It has to become an ecology. It has to become an ecology where we're thinking of life cycles of cities as mini cities within cities, is how I like to kind of describe this discussion now. That, you know, to make development that is just ruthlessly efficient and just returns money back to the developer is irresponsible. It needs to do much more. It needs to predict the kind of the life cycle of the community. It needs to look at the diversity that should be invested in. It needs to look at the quality of the new coming generation that will emerge from that development and look at how that can be supported through the idea of the development. I mean, in short, what I'm saying is that I just think we need to complicate the matrix of the topology of the built environment, and homes should be much more complicated than just being about lots of housing. We know we can build tons of housing. Actually, if the government insists that it's going to shift its defense budget towards housing, we can build so much housing, it would just, you know, we would run past the numbers that we actually need. That's actually not quite the issue. The issue is how to do it and what to do and what makes sense within this context. I think that's really becoming the conversation right now.
And can I just ask a question for both of you, I guess, is, you know, when I see, David, you commissioned to build, you know, you mentioned in Abu Dhabi, you know, the Abrahamic Center, or, you know, was looking at I think it's called the Ruby City, in Texas, or the Holocaust Memorial, or the National, you know, Cathedral in Accra itself. You know, there's whether you like them or you don't like them, they are wonderful expressions of art, right? They are beautiful moments where there is clearly someone has had a creative set of decisions, right? Now the problem with housing is it doesn't always feel like that. It feels as though someone's produced what was being produced before. And so I wonder, actually both for Ran and for David, whether or not you can envisage a world in which that kind of creativity is applied to the housing market in the way in which it is to the big public infrastructure projects and public memorial projects.
Can I just jump in, Ryan, quickly, just to help you? And it'd be lovely to hear how you answer that too. I think that the conversation is, you know, something I hinted at also in my early statement, which is to stop medicalizing housing as a kind of, what's the symptom, let's solve the problem. And to think of housing as the kind of dwelling place of human beings. You know, we've forgotten to think about housing as the dwelling place of human beings. In the 21st century, what do we want housing to be? And we've sort of, what I call medicalized housing, turned it into something that we just must analyze and produce a lot of. And actually, I think that it's much more sophisticated than that. And also, just the amount of time that we spend in our homes means that housing is no longer just the sum of the area or even the rooms, but the quality of the environment, because we've also become interior creatures. We've become, you know, as human beings, we didn't evolve as interior creatures. We evolved as exterior people that would go into shade for a little bit and hang out outside. And now we live almost 80% of our lives, you know, when you analyze a person's life, 20% of it is outside. Most of the time you're in a box. Yeah. So what is this box that we have now confined ourselves to? And what is the quality of that box is, I think, the big question of the 21st century, because the box and the environment around the box have to perform much, much more if we're going to be resilient human beings. I think what COVID is also showing is that if we just create just volume of stuff, that we will reduce our capacity to be able to kind of live in this planet. You know, we're not all going to be wealthy enough to be able to have a country house with 10 acres and, you know, have a beautiful garden and, you know, which is an ideal, but it's never going to happen for the entire population. There's not enough land mass to do it, and there's not enough, you know, we can't make wealth fast enough for that to be equitable for everyone. So how do we create the value of density to create the inspiration and the resuscitation that we need as human beings? And I think we need to keep going back to understanding what we are as human beings first, and then how we do things in the world to earn money and to, you know, all the other things that kind of come from that. And I think the analysis produces, where you've seen amazing projects do that, incredible results that are just startling. They're startling because it starts with the human experience, not the medical equation. Where would you like to live? And why is that such a problem to dream about? And I'm to get involved in that. I mean, we're working on it's a luxury project, unfortunately, but it's a beautiful project where in New York, we're asked to do a tower. And I spent my entire time with my client insisting on developing as much public life within the tower as possible, from rooftop experiences to courtyards, you know, places that people can be alone or gather together. And as a result, it's probably one of the best-selling sort of towers in this market right now. And I'm not trying to promote myself, but we all been talking in the teams that, you know, it was hard for the client at the beginning, but actually they're so excited about what they are able to now say about high density living. High density living doesn't mean it's pandemic, it's actually bad, you know, it's going to make it worse. It can actually be also a way to control and to have the sustainability of communities during lockdown.
Yes.
Able to isolate people and for them to still live.
Ran, out of interest, what do you think about how we can rethink housing and think about it more creatively?
World of issues going into that, but I suppose the thing I'm picking on is that idea of scale. How do we make it more broadly? And thinking of my question with David Miliband this morning, and one of David's comments was that a lot of the actions that have been put out there around the SDGs haven't been delivered at scale. We've proven we can deliver them, but we just can't get them to scale. And it's the same with housing. We can build sustainable, low carbon, energy efficient, high air quality houses now, cost competitively in the mass market, but the mass market's not delivering them. People want to buy them, but they're not being offered the choice.
Exactly.
So how can we actually get this type of construction into the mass market? And then the economies of scale kick in and it all just happens. And that, I think, is our real challenge.
Exactly.
So I'm so excited that we're having this conversation, Ran and David, because I think that there's been a sense at the beginning of lockdown, at the beginning of the pandemic, that we could reimagine the way we live our lives. And the great risk is, as this thing drags on, that kind of ambition fades and it's, you know, let's just get back to normal. So is it really, really helpful? I'm going to do something, David, if I might, which is just bring in a clutch of people to sort of put some points at you. So a rat-a-tat-tat, if you don't mind. Jess, Delson, if you're there, I just wanted you to make the point, you made a point in the chat, I think, about health and well-being as a metric in the way in which we develop houses or buildings and city centres. Yeah,
the point I was trying to get across was, from my admittedly jaded viewpoint as a young student, I think David hit the nail on the head when he was talking about a luxury development in York, which enabled him to look into spending the time and the resources on developing the local area as well, and the community experiences, as well as just the residential units themselves. In the chat, Eniola Price also made the point that where is the capitalist private sector consideration in any of this discussion we're having? We could have the most beautiful ideas in the world as regards to engaging local communities, creating healthier, more beneficial places to live, especially in current circumstances where it's looking like the traditional office commute is going to be a thing of the past for a good year or two, maybe longer. Without a realistic capitalist perspective, which is why I was thinking about why not attempting to create some kind of health and well-being metric, which, yes, admittedly perhaps goes against the grain of what David was saying earlier about demedicalizing housing. Yeah. But I'm just trying to reconcile this kind of, I call utopian dream that many an architect has, many a student has, many a designer has, with the reality of, because I'm seeing just from a purely English perspective, a great many residential developments in the countryside in Kent and East Sussex, which are just going with the same old cookie cutter typography, or typology rather, that doesn't really take in any consideration new advances other than local ordinance requirements of putting solar panels on roofs. And I am beyond frustrated of the lack of engagement that architects and designers can actually have in the process, because all of this is siloed by construction firms, by big developers who have made a capitalist grab at this particular size of the market. And there's seemingly very little anybody, even with the best of intentions, can do about it. Again, we're seeing it on a larger scale in London with recent scandals involving the housing minister about shoving through developments which make no sense.
Jess, thank you very much. David, I'm going to just do a couple of comments at a time, and just because we've got limited time, I'm going to ask people just to sort of keep to the point. Sally Young, you raised a question about the heart of cities and the future nature of cities, and I'm going to come to you, Zoe Tarrant, and then Eniola Price, I'm going to come to you too.
Yes, well, the city that I live in, there's about 250,000, 300,000 people. Newcastle upon Tyne.
Where are you, Sally?
Newcastle upon Tyne. Big student population. So, like a number of English cities, and it's dominated the city centre by office space, by retail, by leisure, by culture, by hospitality. Now, each of those has its own issue in the COVID times, and we can start to see with some of them in particular, whether working from home, the impact of that. So my query, it'd be about what is going to be happening to the cities in the future. And we've also seen what I would call the privatisation of public spaces, that things that were free before you can't use. So it's not just about physical accessibility, it's also about financial accessibility. And if we are going to have housing back in the city centres, which I would completely support, it's got to be mixed housing that's affordable for everybody, and not just what we're seeing here, sort of high-rise expensive developments that overlook a particular football ground. So I just wondered what you were thinking about repurposing of city centres. I don't think I'm panicking, but I think it's got to happen.
David, I'm going to invite Eniola and who else was I just turning to? Well, let me go to Eniola first. And so, actually, Zoe, I was going to come to you first. Zoe Tarrant, you there? Zoe, can we hear you?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can, loud and clear, far away.
So as a student, I think we were talking about earlier this morning about it was like the misinformation on online. And one thing I found since the COVID pause, as I think as someone else said on here, I found that the Black Lives Matter movement in general was really reinvigorated by the fact that we were all on our phones, we could all see the information readily. And actually, I think it's a really good example of how social media, especially with young people, can really push forward like really reinvigorate new ideas and stuff like that. And I was just sort of, my question is, especially within the Black Lives Matter movement, and I mean, I know where I live, we have got a lot of, and it's just outside of London, like Windsor and Maidenhead, and there is a lot of there's a lot of buildings building going on for new flats and stuff like that, which are very well for the area. I think it's very expensive, which for a lot of people you can't. A lot of people won't be able to afford. I know if I wanted to move out of my home now, I definitely wouldn't be able to afford to live anywhere near here. And I know a lot of that's, and I think that's the same for a lot of other people. But especially in the Black Lives Matter movement, how going forward do you think that could be incorporated into redevelopment and planning and things like that?
Zoe, thank you so much. Well, this is going to be a tough commission, David, because you're going to have to try and do all of these different things in one long sweep. I'll remind you what they are. But Eniola Price, Eniola. You don't have a pen. I realise it's a bit unfair. Eniola.
All right. First off, I want to say that we should stop designing houses and start designing homes. I know every one of us here, as we have our source, where we have where we come from. So me going back to my village, I know how it feels when I go back home. I know it's different from the city because in the village, it's home for me. So we should start designing homes instead of designing houses. Homes are functional. And I think Oslo has done a good thing with as regards building homes and building a functional system. And that is what I would say. We require design systems. I think the leadership of communities of city center require design systems that would be set in place for people, the private sector or the public sector to adhere. It's just like a guideline. It's not law, but it's a guideline whereby people would, follow those set of guidelines to design functional homes. And lastly, David, please, I want you to answer my question, which is, how do you effectively, what is the strategy to bring the capitalist, stakeholder to the drawing board? Because without the capitalist stakeholders and involvement or their consideration, we're actually living in an idealistic world, not in a realistic world.
Okay, thank you. Eniola, thank you. So just so you missed it, Jess on capitalism and cookie cutter design, to paraphrase Jess, Sally on hearts of cities, both the leisure and students, but also privatization of public spaces, Zoe on activism, but the failure of that to translate into lived accommodation, and Eniola on homes and the capitalist stakeholder. Over to you, David.
Absolutely. So with Jess, I couldn't agree with you more, and I think we're aligned with our sympathies. I think that what is unfortunately happening is that these cookie cutter buildings are being driven by two things, two fears. One, the fear of experimentation and of trying new things that maybe make sense but have not been tested. And two, the fear of change in our environments by parts of the communities who just don't want things to look different to what they see, and that is a very powerful set of forces that forces councillors to compromise and to not push for ideas that actually are about the greater good. I think that a lot of that happens, and it's kind of about the way in which the system creates this lobbying and this invisible discussion. So it's something that we need to push against and we need to work against, because I think this time, COVID, this moment has shown us that we need to be much braver about these issues, and we can't stay still, because the world that we have simply doesn't meet the challenges of where we are in the 21st century. And then with the lady from Newcastle, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that the age of what I call unicentric cities are dead, that you sort of live in the suburbs and you go to the center of some sort, that we have to live in what I call multiple villages, that the idea of the city has to be reconfigured back into the idea of multiple villages. And what I mean by that is that neighborhoods need to have everything in them, that they need to be complete ecosystems that allow people to migrate from different villages in close proximity together. So in a way, for me, what the city should be is, when villages were far away and we decided to make a city, what we should have done was just strung the villages up together and then worked on the interstitial spaces between them, instead of thinking we should just make an efficient grid of just single typologies that were big, that allowed lots of people to come in. That's my simplistic, but so what I hope is that what this lesson is showing is that we need to kind of complicate the city, create more mixed use, create more income diversity. When I say diversity, I mean it in terms of class, income, and race. That it's about creating the kind of ecology that allows people to learn from each other, and also to kindergarten from each other abilities. We're human beings, that's what we need. And then the Black Lives Matter discussion, right? And the activism. I think that what's been amazing, what has catapulted the Black Lives Matter, is that we're all sitting still. And we were all fixed to our screens because we needed an outlet to the world. And this flashpoint that has been happening, every so often, but just doesn't get picked up by the news cycles, doesn't get picked up by the mainstream media, just burst into everybody's sort of, bedroom. And I think that horror of not waiting for that, television producer or whoever it is to mediate this force that was happening, and for it to bypass that and go straight to our phones, has kind of birthed a new consciousness about how we relate to each other. And I think it's a new consciousness about how we, take information, that we don't trust necessarily somebody editing it. We want to directly live feed in an input. And I think that is going to have massive impact that we're just starting to unpack in terms of our democracy and how you make, your voice heard about what you need in your community. There are ways now that you can input into that. And I think that speaks for a much more exciting future than the one that we've had, where you would have to try and find your counselor to speak to him if you were lucky, if you could ever see where he was, and all these things. So I think that you should see this moment as a moment of potential hope, of how to start impacting the system to be the world that you want it to be. And I think it requires you to be part of that impact. And then the last one was this idea of home versus houses. And I hope that you sort of used the word functional, which threw me, but I love that you said home instead of houses, because for me, the village, yes, is deadly functional, but it's actually, what it does is that it's the kind of result of many generations creating an atmosphere that feels like it sustains human life in all its fundamental forms, from spiritual to emotional to sort of efficient, some agriculture, to, you know, aspiration. And I think that that is part of what we need to start to rethink about when we think about our homes and our spaces, that we're just not making, you know, boxes that tick numbers, but we're really thinking about the environments that these, you know, it's not about the scale either. It's not about the shape. The shape and the form are one thing, but it's how they make relationships to each other. It's not just about view and light. It's about communities. It's about all these other things. It's about multi-generational living. All these things are part of the ecology of what makes a home. That's what we love about a village, the ability to see all the diversity, the different age groups, the different types of spaces, the different communities that are in, that we lack in the city, which starts to become sanitized and, you know, made into these things. You know, in a way, what's happened in the medical industry, which I think is now rebelling, where it became just more and more sanitized and more like a sort of iPhone, you know, just clean and pristine with chemicals and no light and windows. And now they're realizing they need to let the sunlight in, is also what needs to happen to housing. We started to make housing like these functional boxes that we would just deliver, maybe paint them white, because so that people will feel good about it. But essentially they were vanilla boxes. And now we're realizing that that doesn't work, and that doesn't create resilient human beings and active human beings in our communities. And we need to do much more than that. So I would say that, yeah. Sorry, James.
No, I'm just conscious of time, and I just saw that Robert Campbell had his digital hand up for a while. And I wanted to make sure Robert got to make a point, and I want to come back to you with just 2 geography questions.
So hi, I'm from Newcastle as well. So hi, local Northerners.
Yeah,
I'm something of an activist in trying to create sustainable things within cities. So I've recently started an e-cargo bike company, and I'm really interested in the way that the local authorities have recently published a net zero 2030 within Newcastle with an idea to try and make things much more sustainable. Combined with the cycling infrastructure and developments, there are lots of really good examples of the way that these things have been implemented worldwide. One of my favorite books is a book, I can't remember the author's name, called Happy City, which describes the way in which we can dehumanize cities by building blank walls effectively at the bottom of skyscrapers, rather than what's been done recently to introduce a very much more human level scale at the city floor level. But none of these things seem to be making a mark in today's developments. There's certainly some new developments in Newcastle around Helix, for example, where the architects have built some really what they would call award-winning buildings, but they don't seem to have gathered the lessons from elsewhere or the best practice from elsewhere. And the cycling infrastructure is utterly ridiculous in terms of its paucity and scarcity and everything else. What can we do to make these people who are making decisions right now, some with the best intentions of the world, absorb best practice from around the world? The 15-minute city is kind of my dream, all hooked up with bikes. It's got to come, but I can't see a way to make people open their minds.
It will.
Thank you.
Sorry, James, jump in.
No, I was just saying over to you, David. Yeah.
No, wonderful. I mean, everything you said is exactly what we're all demanding of the future. And I think actually, I think that because we're talking about it this way, it is starting to hit the decision makers, and it is coming up to, you know, I'm thinking about the kind of new things that are being discussed by the mayor of Paris, for instance, or that the London mayor is actually considering right now. I know because I'm an advisor. This is starting to become a discussion that is not going to be able to be sort of, you know, sidetracked. Citizens are demanding this. You're demanding it. You know, less articulate citizens are demanding it because we see that there's a value in it. And as we demand it, these mayors and the powers that be have to react, because we simply don't want the product that's being peddled anymore. We want a sort of, as I call it, sort of architectural evolutionary jump to something much more able to kind of be relational to us in a way that enhances our humanity and sustains our relationship and to nature. And this is going to carry on getting much more intense as we create more people on the world. I mean, we're an 8 billion person planet. Imagine when it's 15 billion, what the conversation is going to be. And that's predicted in 100 years. And
David, could you just, Robert, thank you. You know, one of the reasons I find myself or feel incredibly lucky doing these thinkings is you have these moments where someone says something and you suddenly go, aha, yes, that's what I think. I've never thought it before, but yes, that's what I think. And when you made that point about unicentric cities versus multiple villages, you know, I went into this conversation with you thinking, okay, what have we got to tick off here? We've got to tick off climate, right? We've got to tick off essentially not just Black Lives Matter, but the kind of structural injustice of our cities, the postcode injustice of our cities.
Right.
And we've also got to tick off the, do we want to commute into work anymore? The kind of the pandemic lesson and home and working from home.
Yeah.
And when you said multiple villages, I was like, aha, okay, well that potentially does tick off all those things, not least because it's much easier to, if you like, bring the benefits of city life to different parts of the city than it is to move people around. And so I just wondered whether you would just sort of flesh out for us what a multiple village city would look like, what the essential elements of it would be, and how it would operate.
I think that what I envisage when I say that, and I think it works because in a way the idea of the village is a human construction in every culture. It's sort of the beginnings of our coming together. So every community and culture has this notion of the village. And I think that within it are constituent parts that really are about the kind of ecology that sustains a community together. And so I think we need to sort of start thinking about what those essential things are. So if it's an agrarian farming community, that farming life is part of the ecology of that community and how it kind of makes itself. Whether it's urban farming, you know, suddenly if it's in a dense situation, that should still be part of the ecology of that space. If it's about, you know, the performing arts and all this, you know, I mean, in my ideal scenario, we don't just have sort of one theater, you know, sort of like the grand, but we have a discombobulated set of pieces that all work right up to the ideal city, right up to being part of even the home. You know, that the home even has fragments of all these elements at the same time, from your ability to grow your own food in your own house, right through to being able to work if you wanted to perform. That's nirvana. But let's get towards it. Going towards it, the city needs to evolve those parts so that, as was just said, the 15-minute city is a reality. Because if you are in these sort of 21st century conditions where pandemics will tear apart communities, you need to be able to isolate but not destroy economies. And having a kind of an ecology where you can still kind of perform without needing to use infrastructure that's been shut down, etc., is a way to build resilience. You can enclose that community, control pandemics, treat it, and then also kind of allow other communities to, you know, thrive or grow or kind of work through their elements, or then combine them as larger ecologies when these things are more sort of networked. I think that's part of the success of something like New Zealand. It's part of that idea of the kit of small communities that are able to come together, isolate, but also not have this centralized sort of planning. You know, and I think that you're seeing also under what is so known as non-developed cities, where actually what happens is that the communities are operating like little villages because there's no central image yet, because the city hasn't fully developed. And I think the resilience that you're seeing, you know, places like Senegal being, you know, the country that is second after New Zealand, most people don't realize that, in dealing with COVID abilities, because of the ability of the community to be, you know, in pockets of villages and to have an active relationship to the outside world, etc. And you see it in Ghana. Ghana's ability to deal with the COVID issue so successfully is because its communities also operate in this way. So I think there are lessons also that we're now learning about places that we thought weren't part of our analysis because we'd gone far past them, but actually realizing that they are living a much more human, you know, what I call outdoor experience in relationship to nature that we need to learn from to kind of create the worlds that we're talking about in the Western world that need to shift. Because actually what we're talking about is a fundamental relationship to nature and a fundamental relationship to our patterns of life that have a relationship to our units called our families, whatever they may be. You know, it's this matrix that we're kind of working through here.
Okay, well, David, thank you. I have to say, the reason I just sort of looked gripped and not responding, because I'm so excited to hear an idea of the way we live, particularly in that relationship with nature and as you say, the broader idea of family, people you love. It's such an invigorating one. And if you'd been in the conversation through the course of the day, you know, there are some really chewy problems, and it's hard to come away with a blueprint, if you like, for something that can remake the patterns of our life. But you've managed to do that in talking about multiple villages. So that's really changed the way in which I think not just about cities, but about the geography of the world and how we could respond to this, which was exactly what we hoped to do in holding this summit today. I just want to say that in the terms that I'd set myself for our conversation, this was a colossal failure, because I wanted to do architecture and memorials, I wanted to do faith and buildings, I wanted to do Ghana and the world and how you'd reimagined it. So we're going to have to come back and do all of those things another time. On behalf of everyone, thank you. It's been brilliant listening to you. Thank you for your time. We can't applaud you, we can wave at you and smile in your general direction. So a huge thank you. Anyone who can, please do stick on for the last and final session. The great Ivo Daalder, who's the head of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, is going to lead us in I hope, a rethinking of global leadership and the institutions of international cooperation. David Adjaye, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, James. Thank you all.